Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala ali Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He changed history. His name was Salahuddin Al-Ayyubi.
History remembers many powerful rulers. Some are remembered because they conquered vast lands. Some are remembered because they built enormous armies. Others are remembered because their names became symbols of fear. But every once in a while, history gives us a leader who is remembered for something deeper than power. A leader whose story is not only about battles, kingdoms, and victories, but about character, patience, sacrifice, and the ability to remain principled when the world around him is filled with conflict. One of those remarkable figures was Salahuddin Al-Ayyubi, known in the West as Saladin. He lived during one of the most turbulent periods of Muslim history, when the Muslim world was divided. The Crusader states controlled important parts of the region, and Jerusalem was under Crusader rule. Yet from this difficult situation emerged a man who would change the political landscape of the Middle East and become one of the most famous Muslim leaders in history. His journey did not begin with a grand throne or an enormous empire. It began with a young man growing up in a family connected to military and political life at a time when the Muslim world desperately needed unity. Salahuddin was born in 1137 or 1138 in Tikrit, in present-day Iraq, into the Kurdish Rawadiya family of the Ayyubid clan. His father, Najm al-Din Ayyub, and his uncle Shirkuh were important military figures. When Salahuddin was still young, his family became connected with the Zengid ruler Nur al-Din, who was working to strengthen Muslim power against the Crusader states. Salahuddin's early life was therefore shaped by a world where politics, military strategy, religion, and survival were deeply connected. But the young Salahuddin was not simply born as the legendary warrior that later generations would remember. His character developed over time. He learned leadership through experience, responsibility through difficult circumstances, and patience through years of political struggle. His greatest achievement would not be simply defeating an enemy army. His greatest achievement would be helping transform a divided Muslim political landscape into a stronger force capable of challenging the Crusader presence in the region. During the 12th century, the political situation of the Muslim world was extremely complicated. Muslim rulers were not always united, and different cities and territories were controlled by competing leaders. Meanwhile, the Crusader states had been established in the Levant after the First Crusade. Jerusalem, one of the most sacred cities in Islam, had been captured by the Crusaders in 1099. For generations, the memory of Jerusalem remained deeply important to Muslims. But wanting to recover a city and having the political strength to recover it were two very different things. Salahuddin understood this reality. He realized that emotional speeches alone could not change history. A strong political foundation, disciplined armies, stable administration, and unity were necessary. His path toward that goal began when his uncle Shirkuh was sent to Egypt as part of Nur al-Din's efforts to influence the region. Salahuddin accompanied him. In Egypt, circumstances changed rapidly. After a series of political struggles, Shirkuh became vizier to the Fatimid Caliph, but he died soon afterward in 1169. Salahuddin, despite being relatively young, was appointed to succeed him as vizier. This was a remarkable turning point. He now held enormous responsibility in Egypt, but the position was not simple. Egypt was politically unstable, the Fatimid government was weakening, and Salahuddin had to balance his relationship with Nur al-Din while establishing his own authority. Instead of rushing blindly toward personal power, he gradually strengthened the institutions around him. He reorganized the military, worked to stabilize Egypt, and eventually brought an end to the Fatimid Caliphate in 1171, restoring Sunni political authority under the Abbasid Caliphate. This was one of the most important political changes of his career. Yet Salahuddin's rise also created a difficult question. Would he remain subordinate to Nur al-Din, or would he become an independent ruler? History would soon answer that question. When Nur al-Din died in 1174, the political situation changed dramatically. Salahuddin moved into Syria and began consolidating territories that could potentially unite Muslim power. He faced opposition not only from Crusader forces, but also from Muslim rulers who feared his growing influence. This part of his story is important because it shows that history was not simply Muslims against Crusaders. The Muslim world itself was divided by political rivalries, competing ambitions and struggles for control. Salahuddin had to navigate these challenges carefully. Through military campaigns, diplomacy, alliances and political negotiations, he gradually brought Egypt, Syria and other territories under his authority. He was building something larger than a personal army. He was creating the political strength necessary for a long-term struggle. His objective was not achieved in a single battle. It took years of effort, patience, and difficult decisions. And this is one of the most valuable lessons from his life. Major victories are often prepared long before the world sees them. People may remember the moment of triumph, but they often forget the years of preparation that made that triumph possible. Salahuddin understood that a leader could not simply demand loyalty. He had to create stability and give people a reason to believe in a common purpose. By the late 1170s and early 1180s, his power had expanded considerably. His position was becoming stronger, while the Crusader states remained a significant military and political presence. The stage was being prepared for one of the most famous confrontations of the medieval world. Among the Crusader leaders, Rinald of Ctillon became one of Salahuddin's most persistent enemies. Rinald repeatedly attacked Muslim trade routes and territories, and at one point threatened attempts to attack Muslim lands and shipping in the Red Sea. These actions increased tensions dramatically. Salahuddin had spent years strengthening his position, and now the conflict was moving toward a major confrontation. In 1187, the moment arrived. The Crusader army, led by King Guy of Jerusalem, marched toward the Muslim forces. Salahuddin carefully positioned his army and used the difficult terrain and lack of water to his advantage. The two forces eventually met near the area known as the Horns of Hattin. What followed became one of the most decisive battles of the Crusades. The Crusader army was exhausted, thirsty, and struggling under intense conditions. Salahuddin's forces surrounded and defeated the Crusader army on July 4th, 1187. The victory at Hattin was not merely a military success. It changed the entire balance of power in the region. King Guy was captured, Rinald of Ctillon was also captured, and the Crusader army suffered a devastating defeat. Salahuddin now had an opportunity that generations of Muslim rulers had dreamed about. The road toward Jerusalem was open. But here is where the story becomes even more significant. Salahuddin was not simply a warrior seeking revenge. He was a ruler facing enormous responsibility. After Hattin, Muslim forces captured many Crusader strongholds, and city after city came under Salahuddin's control. Eventually, Jerusalem itself was surrounded. The city had been under Crusader control for nearly 9 decades. For Muslims, its recovery was an extraordinary moment. For Christians living there, however, the situation was terrifying. The memory of the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099 was still part of the history of the region, when large numbers of inhabitants had been killed during the Crusader capture of the city. Salahuddin now had the power to decide what would happen. Would he repeat the violence of the past? Would he seek revenge? Or would he choose another path? Negotiations took place between Salahuddin and the defenders of Jerusalem. After the city surrendered in October 1187, arrangements were made for many inhabitants to leave through payment of ransom, while others who could not pay were also dealt with under negotiated terms. Salahuddin allowed the Eastern Christian population to remain, and the city's holy places were restored to Muslim control. The surrender of Jerusalem became one of the defining moments of his life. The city had been recovered after generations, but Salahuddin's conduct afterward became part of the reason his name survived in history, not merely as a conqueror, but as a ruler associated with restraint and mercy. This does not mean that the period was free from violence or that every event connected to Salahuddin was peaceful. Medieval warfare was brutal, and his campaigns included battles, deaths, executions, and political coercion. Historical honesty requires us to acknowledge that reality. But compared with the expectations of revenge that could have followed the conquest of Jerusalem, his decision to negotiate surrender and avoid a mass slaughter of the city's population was significant. News of the fall of Jerusalem shocked Europe. Pope Gregory VIII called for another major crusade, and some of the most powerful rulers of Europe answered the call. The Third Crusade began, bringing figures such as Richard I of England, known as Richard the Lionheart, into direct conflict with Salahuddin. This created one of the most famous rivalries in medieval history. Richard was an extraordinary military commander, and Salahuddin was an equally determined strategist. Their armies fought across the region, and neither side achieved complete victory. The Crusaders recovered important coastal territory, including Acre, and Richard won several significant battles. Salahuddin, however, retained control of Jerusalem. The conflict became a long struggle of military pressure, diplomacy, negotiations, and changing alliances. Richard and Salahuddin never met in a famous dramatic duel on the battlefield, as legends sometimes suggest, but they communicated through envoys and developed a remarkable mutual respect. Their rivalry demonstrated that leadership is not always about destroying the opponent. Sometimes the greatest leaders recognize strength even in those who stand against them. Eventually, after years of warfare, negotiations produced the Treaty of Jaffa in 1192. The agreement allowed the Crusaders to retain a coastal presence, while Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. Christian pilgrims were permitted access to the city's holy sites. The Third Crusade ended without the Crusaders retaking Jerusalem. Salahuddin had achieved one of his most important objectives. Yet perhaps the most powerful part of Salahuddin's story is what happened after the battles. Victory did not make him immortal. His wealth did not protect him from death. His armies could not stop time. After years of campaigning and leadership, Salahuddin died in Damascus on March 4th, 1193, at around 55 years of age. According to historical accounts, despite ruling a large territory, he left behind relatively little personal wealth. His generosity and extensive charitable giving were well known. Whether every later story about his personal possessions is perfectly accurate is difficult to establish, but the broader historical picture is clear. Salahuddin did not live simply to accumulate luxury. His life was centered on political leadership, military responsibility, and the causes he believed were important. When he died, the Muslim world had lost a remarkable leader. But his story had already become larger than his lifetime. His name traveled across cultures. Muslim historians remembered him as a powerful ruler who recovered Jerusalem. Christian and Western writers, despite being on the opposing side of the conflict, often portrayed him with a degree of admiration that was unusual for a medieval enemy. Over the centuries, legends grew around him, sometimes mixing historical fact with romantic storytelling. That is why we must be careful when studying his life. A powerful historical figure does not need invented miracles or exaggerated stories to become inspiring. The truth is already powerful enough. So what can a Muslim living centuries later learn from Salahuddin Al-Ayyubi? The first lesson is that great change begins with preparation. Salahuddin did not wake up one morning and suddenly become the leader who captured Jerusalem. Years of political work, military organization, diplomacy, setbacks, and difficult decisions came first. If you are struggling today, remember that your current chapter may not be the final chapter of your story. You may be in a season of preparation that nobody else can see. The second lesson is unity. Salahuddin understood that divided Muslim powers were vulnerable. He worked to bring territories and political forces together before attempting to achieve the larger objective. In our own lives, division can weaken us too. Sometimes the greatest battle is not against an outside enemy, but against the disagreements, distractions, jealousy, pride, and selfishness within ourselves. The third lesson is patience. Salahuddin did not achieve his goal through one dramatic action. He spent years building strength. We live in an age where people want immediate results. We want success quickly, recognition quickly, wealth quickly, and answers quickly. But history teaches us that meaningful achievements often require long periods of quiet effort. Allah may be preparing you through a process that feels slow because you are not yet ready for what you are asking for. Another lesson is leadership through responsibility. Salahuddin carried enormous pressure, yet his greatest moments were not simply moments when he defeated an enemy. They were moments when he had power and had to decide how to use it. Real strength is not merely the ability to hurt someone. Real strength is having power and still understanding responsibility. This principle is deeply relevant today. You may never command an army or rule a city, but you still have influence. You may influence your children, your friends, your students, your colleagues, your family, or even one person watching your content. The question is not only, how much influence do I have? The better question is, what do I do with the influence Allah has given me? Salahuddin's story reminds us that leadership is a trust. The final lesson is that worldly victory is temporary. Jerusalem changed hands. Armies rose and disappeared. Kings were celebrated and then forgotten. Castles were built and eventually became ruins. Salahuddin himself, despite all his power, eventually returned to Allah. This is perhaps the greatest reminder of all. No matter how successful you become, your final destination is not this world. Wealth will remain behind. Titles will remain behind. Buildings will remain behind. Even your name may eventually fade. What remains with you is what you did for Allah and how you treated His creation. Imagine standing in Damascus centuries ago as the news of Salahuddin's death spreads through the city. The man who had commanded armies, negotiated with kings, and recovered Jerusalem was now gone. His soldiers could not bring him back. His political power could not extend his life. His victories could not prevent death. That is the reality every human being eventually faces. And perhaps that is why his story still matters. Salahuddin Al-Ayyubi was not remembered simply because he won a battle. He was remembered because his life represented a combination of determination, strategy, faith, patience, sacrifice, and leadership during one of the most difficult periods of his age. His story does not tell us that every person must become a warrior or a ruler. It tells us something much more relevant. Become strong in character before you seek strength in position. Build yourself before you try to change the world. Learn patience before demanding victory. Seek unity before expecting success. And when Allah gives you power, remember that power is a test. Today, we may not be standing outside the walls of Jerusalem, and we may not be commanding armies, but every one of us is fighting a different kind of battle. Some are fighting laziness. Some are fighting anger. Some are fighting hopelessness. Some are trying to leave a sin. Some are trying to rebuild their relationship with Allah. Some are carrying pain that nobody around them knows about. Some are trying again after failure. And perhaps the lesson from Salahuddin's life is that greatness is not created in one moment. It is built through thousands of small choices. The decision to pray when you do not feel like praying. The decision to speak truth when lying would be easier. The decision to forgive when revenge feels satisfying. The decision to continue when quitting feels comfortable. The decision to learn when ignorance is easier. The decision to serve others when nobody is watching. These choices may look small today, but character is built through them. And when the moment of responsibility finally comes, your character will determine what you do. Salahuddin Al-Ayyubi changed history, but history did not make him who he was. His choices did. His patience did. His discipline did. His willingness to work through difficult circumstances did. And his story reminds us that sometimes Allah allows a person to rise from an uncertain beginning into a position that affects generations. You may not know what Allah has written for your future. You may feel insignificant today. You may think your efforts are too small to matter. But never underestimate what consistent effort, sincere intention, and trust in Allah can produce over time. You do not need to become famous to live a meaningful life. You do not need thousands of followers to make a difference. You do not need a throne to become a leader. Start with yourself. Lead your own desires. Control your anger. Protect your prayers. Strengthen your relationship with Allah. Treat people with justice. Help those who need you. Stand for what is right with wisdom and patience. That is where real leadership begins. And when you look back at the story of Salahuddin, remember that the greatest lesson is not simply that Jerusalem was recovered. The deeper lesson is that difficult circumstances do not automatically determine the future. A divided world can become more united. A weak position can become stronger. A long struggle can eventually produce victory. But every victory comes with a test, and every power eventually disappears. So ask yourself today, if Allah gave you greater influence tomorrow, would your character be strong enough to carry it? If Allah gave you success, would you remain humble? If Allah gave you authority, would you remain just? If Allah gave you wealth, would you remember those who have less? And if Allah gave you a difficult journey, would you remain patient? Perhaps this is the true legacy of Salahuddin Al-Ayyubi. Not merely a story about a warrior who captured Jerusalem, but a reminder that history is shaped by people who are willing to carry responsibility when the moment demands it. His life began in a turbulent world, passed through years of struggle, reached the heights of political and military power, and ended with the same reality that awaits every human being: return to Allah. So let us take the lesson, not simply admire the legend. Let us build patience before we demand victory, character before recognition, unity before power, and faith before success. Because the world may remember your achievements, but Allah knows your intentions, your sacrifices, your private struggles, and the choices you made when nobody was watching. May Allah help us learn from the righteous and courageous figures of our history. Give us wisdom without arrogance, strength without patience, without despair, and success that brings us closer to Him. And may we never forget that the greatest victory is not conquering the world, but conquering the weakness within ourselves and living a life that Allah is pleased with. Ameen wa sallamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.